Good. All right, hello everybody. Welcome to the National Security Policy Speaker Series. This is a joint production of the Nonproliferation Policy Education Center, the Center for Peace and Security Studies at the Political Science Department here, and the Korea Pacific Program at GPS. I'm John Lindsay. I'm actually here from the University of Toronto, where it is minus 20 centigrade right now. So I am utterly thrilled to be here for the next several months at CPS. But we are here today to welcome Colonel David Maxwell. He's going to be talking to us about the security situation on the Korean Peninsula and threats to the U.S.-Korean alliance. He is a fantastic person to talk to us about this. He retired from the U.S. Army as a colonel in the Special Forces, which is no mean feat. He's got, if I count this right, 3 master's degrees, no less than 3 master's degrees from professional military education institutions, and ended up teaching national security strategy at the National War College. But not just teaching this, he actually put that to work by working firsthand on some of the major operational plans, campaign plans on the Korean Peninsula, as well as working as the Chief of Staff at U.S. Special Operations Command Korea. Now, I found this really interesting, your background, because in many ways, U.S. Special Operations Command is kind of emblematic of the irregular, unconventional, hybrid warfare style of international conflict that has been typical, well, since the end of the Cold War and certainly in the post-9/11 wars. But at the same time, you focused on the Korean Peninsula, where we're now looking at one of the most conflict-prone regions of the world that could potentially start World War III. And so you've kind of got both the high end and the low end embodied in one. And then when you roll in together the theoretical background, I think that you, sir, really are the embodiment of the future of war in many ways. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Colonel Maxwell to take the stage. And I think you're mic'd up.
Yes. Thank you very much. Thank you for those kind words. And I don't know, though, if I want to be called the future of war, and especially when we're here to talk about peace and security. So it's great to be here. I came out from Washington, so we had some snow out there. So it's nice to come out to the warmer climate out here. So thank you for having me. To my Korean friends, 안녕하십니까, 쳔백해 습니다. 죄송합니다. 한국말 조금 합니다. So I will speak English. So I'm going to talk about a lot of things on the Korean Peninsula here, I guess about 45 minutes or so, and then we'll do Q&A. This picture, I did spend almost 3 years on the DMZ in the 1980s in the 2nd Division, and I never thought I would see a picture like this. And this is, of course, at the military demarcation line, which bisects the DMZ, the 4-kilometer wide DMZ. And of course, you have a North Korean soldier on the left and a South Korean soldier on the right. And I show this picture. I use this picture a lot now because this is illustrative of North Korean propaganda. And if you pay attention to this picture, you see the North Korean soldier with the tall hat. He's actually standing on higher ground, perfectly set there to be looking down on his Republic of Korea counterpart, who of course is in body armor and helmet, and the North Korean soldiers are, just carrying sidearms there. And of course, I'm sure that this picture is being used for propaganda in North Korea to show, their view that they're superior to South Korea. And it's something that we should pay attention to, and the use of propaganda. Of course, this photo was taken by a South Korean photographer, but it's something when I actually did a talk for the U.S. Embassy in South Korea, sent journalists from throughout the region, and I talked to them about this. I said, you got to be witting to how the North Koreans will set you up for propaganda. But of course, we're not bad at propaganda ourselves. And I show this picture because on the left you have our Navy sailors from the USS Pueblo who were captured by North Korea. And of course, military personnel are taught to resist in hostility, and of course they were being used for propaganda pictures. And if you notice the gestures that they're making there, that was to transmit back to America that they were resisting. That they couldn't be used for propaganda. And of course, the North Koreans asked them, what is that gesture? And they said it's the Hawaiian good luck symbol, which lasted until their intelligence figured out what it was. But I juxtapose that with Kim Yo-jong, who is Kim Jong-un's sister, who's the deputy head of the Propaganda and Agitation Department. This was at the Pyongyang summit here. I don't think she apparently liked the photographers taking pictures of her, so I don't know if that was an inadvertent gesture or was an expression of her true feelings. So I like to say that maybe we got something back from her, or maybe they've learned from our sailors who resisted valiantly in the Pueblo. Let me talk up front here. I'm a military person. I don't want war. I want peace on the Korean Peninsula. I support a diplomatic solution to the nuclear crisis, the nuclear threat. I support ROK engagement, the Republic of Korea engagement with the North. But I don't support weakening the ROK-US alliance. And I think that we've got to maintain a strong alliance until there is a solution to the Korea question. What is the Korea question? The Korea question comes from the Armistice Agreement in 1953, paragraph 60, which at the time called on all political parties to come together and solve the Korea question, which is, of course, the unnatural division of the Korean Peninsula. And so, of course, they gave a time limit, too. They said within 90 days of the armistice, they're supposed to come together and develop a political solution. Because the armistice was really an agreement among military commanders, not among governments. It was military commanders, and it really did four things. It halted hostilities. So therefore, we're still at war on the Korean Peninsula. Halted hostilities, established the DMZ, established a mechanism for maintaining peace, and pledged that both sides would not attack the other, and a mechanism for returning prisoners. That's really what the armistice did. And it's not a peace treaty, not a peace agreement, and the signatories to the armistice were North Korea. Nam-il was the first to sign it, and General Harrison, U.S. General Harrison, signing for the United Nations Command. Those are the two initial signatories on the armistice. Later, the Chinese People's Volunteers signed, and Kim Il-sung signed as the commander-in-chief of the North Korean People's Army, not as the head of state for North Korea. So the armistice is an agreement among military commanders. And people will say that South Korea didn't sign the armistice, President Syngman Rhee didn't want to. It really doesn't matter because it was, at the time, the Republic of Korea military was under the operational control of the United Nations Command. And so the military commander entered into the armistice agreement. And it's really, that's as long as it's, or it's been that way until today. Now, whether there's a peace agreement or not, that's another story, and I'll talk about that. Now, I don't believe that there's going to be a successful outcome without a strong alliance between the U.S. and Korea and Japan and the United States. We need to have our alliances. But I'm a pessimist, and I think that, I'm not sure that Kim Jong-un is really going to negotiate in good faith, and I'll talk about that. Now, secondly, there are no experts in Korea, on North Korea. There are certainly no experts on North Korea. At best, I would call myself a student trying to understand the complex problem. From an intelligence perspective, everyone would say that North Korea is a hard target, and perhaps the hardest target. It is so opaque, so difficult to penetrate and to understand. So I would not call myself an expert, but a student. And so, of course, I'm going to make some very declarative statements. I'm going to tell you what I think I know, what I believe, but almost nothing I say can really be proven as fact. So anything I say can and should be challenged. All right, so North Korea's negotiating strategy since the summits, really Panmunjom, Singapore, and then the Pyongyang summit on September 19th. Really, the agreement in Singapore was really about changing the relationship. Except for returning the 55 remains that North Korea did. Of course, they had as many as 200 remains ready to return, and so they're still holding some 145 remains hostage. What kind of responsible member of the international community is holding those remains, as really a bargaining chip? So we should think about how they're thinking. But we tout the fact that they returned 55 sets of remains as a humanitarian gesture, but to me, it's not enough. But except for that, really the Singapore agreement was about changing the relationship. And really they want some kind of peace regime. Most importantly, and what we're seeing now, if you're following the news, really the demands for sanctions relief. They really want permanent removal. If you study the sanctions, though, President Trump, President Moon, they don't have the authority to lift the sanctions. And they can't lift the sanctions or use the sanctions as a concession or a bargaining chip, because the UN sanctions, as well as the United States legislation imposing sanctions on North Korea, requires that North Korea eliminates its nuclear and missile programs, as well as human rights abuses. So North Korea has not made any substantive progress in denuclearization, and of course it has not eliminated its human rights abuses, and I'll talk about that. The UN Special Rapporteur, Mr. Quintano, just came out with a new statement on saying that North Korea is a virtual prison. Well, maybe not virtual; it's an actual prison. But the sanctions have specific requirements to be lifted. And so all of the demands and the recommendations, and the Chinese, the Russians, and even President Moon to some extent, you can't just lift sanctions as a concession or a bargaining chip. North Korea is required to take substantive steps. Of course, then North Korea wants to talk about denuclearization. And President Trump and President Moon got taken by Kim Jong-un, I think, because they adopted his narrative. Denuclearization of the entire Korean peninsula. It used to be CVID was complete, verifiable, irreversible dismantlement of North Korea's nuclear program. But that's changed to denuclearization, and now in the agreements, it's denuclearization of the entire Korean peninsula. And what that means to North Korea is denuclearization of the South. Now you might say, there are no nuclear weapons in South Korea. President George H.W. Bush removed them in 1991 when North and South Korea were negotiating the first agreement for denuclearization of the entire Korean peninsula. And that word denuclearization was used in 1992. And North and South Korea agreed to maintain a denuclearized peninsula in 1992. And so George H.W. Bush removed U.S. tactical nuclear weapons, and there are no nuclear weapons in South Korea. But from North Korea's perspective, the presence of U.S. troops brings access to nuclear weapons. And of course, as you follow the news, we have deployed strategic assets, B-52 bombers, B-1 bombers, B-2 bombers. We deploy naval assets, aircraft carrier battle groups, at different times. And so North Korea believes all of those carry nuclear weapons and bring nuclear weapons to the peninsula and to the region. And so for North Korea, denuclearization includes denuclearization of the South. And what that really means specifically is an end to the ROK-US alliance, removal of US troops, and an end to the nuclear umbrella over South Korea and Japan. Okay, so it's really important to understand North Korea's view on denuclearization. And once that occurs, once the alliance ends, US troops are off the peninsula, then the North will say, the US has removed its hostile policy, the relationship has changed, we can trust you, and now we'll talk about dismantling North Korea's nuclear program. Of course, sometimes what I put on this slide is, once they do that, then they'll cheat, which of course they've done in almost every agreement, at least since 1994. But really the fundamental difference between North Korea and the United States on denuclearization or dismantlement is, North Korea wants to first change the relationship. They want a better relationship with the United States. That will build trust and then denuclearization. But from the US perspective, it's denuclearization first, then we'll build trust to be able to change the relationship, recognition, diplomatic exchanges, things like that. So we really have a fundamental negotiating conflict position between the two. Now I would say that those are really the extreme positions. The problem is we've had President Trump executing what I like to call unconventional, experimental, top-down diplomacy. He's done what no other president has done, probably no other president could do, and that's, of course, meet with Kim Jong-un. Of course, he's criticized for that, and I think probably rightly so, because he bestowed a great sense of legitimacy on Kim Jong-un by meeting with him. But he did it, and that's done. But I think that what has caused is Kim Jong-un to believe that he can deal directly with President Trump. And so what we have here is President Trump with his art of the deal, and Kim Jong-un and the Kim family regime's art of the deal, which is, of course, based on blackmail diplomacy, the use of provocations to gain political economic concessions, and, of course, the ability to get something for nothing, which North Korea has proved masters at over the last decades. And because of that, what we haven't had are working level talks between our special representative, Stephen Biegun, and North Korea's Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, Kaesong. We've seen Kim Yong-chol, who is, by all reports, flying to Washington, D.C. tomorrow. Kim Yong-chol was head of the Reconnaissance General Bureau, responsible for the sinking of the Cheonun, killing of 46 Republic of Korea sailors. He is an evil man, and he is negotiating, and he'll meet with Secretary Pompeo probably tomorrow, and maybe President Trump on Friday. And of course, he met with him last spring before the Singapore summit as well. But we have not had working level negotiations. My recommendation is that if there is a second summit, that President Trump tells Kim Jong-un that will be the last summit. Because if you don't allow working level negotiations to develop a framework and a timeline and a process for denuclearization, there's no reason to continue that, to continue negotiations. But I think that Kim Jong-un thinks he can make a deal with President Trump. And I hope we're going to be able to disabuse him of that notion. Now, of course, North Korea is very astute. They pay attention to everything the United States does, and they're reading the tea leaves, listening to President Trump's statements as a candidate, his statement at the press conference following the Singapore summit, and his actions in Syria and Afghanistan. And he said that he wants to pull U.S. troops off the peninsula. He's, of course, adopted Kim Jong-un's narrative, saying that our war games are provocative and expensive, and he doesn't want to waste any more money on that. And so, of course, we suspended the major war games last August, as well as the Air Force exercises in December, and we may scale back our exercises in the winter and spring this year. So North Korea is reading those tea leaves and saying, President Trump may be ripe for a deal. And the deal may be remove U.S. troops in return for North Korea's ICBMs and associated nuclear program. End the threat to the U.S. homeland. President Trump can declare victory and pull out U.S. troops and leave the Korea problem to be solved by Koreans. And of course, given President Trump's stance on alliances, South Korea and Japan are very worried about what might happen at the next summit. And it's something we really need to pay attention to. Now, some of the other post-summit issues, of course, I've talked a little bit about the peace treaty, peace regime, the armistice, the mutual defense treaty. Something we should keep in mind that even if there is a peace treaty between North and South, which of course there should be, any peace treaty should be between North and South because they're the belligerents in the Korean Civil War. It actually is a Korean Civil War. And if you read the UN Security Council resolutions 82, 83, 84, and 85, the UN determined that North Korea was the aggressor, attacked South Korea, and called on nations to defend freedom of the Republic of Korea. Of course, established the UN command and made the United States the executive agent of the UN command. Those Security Council resolutions really set up the legal framework for where we are today, and they're still in existence today. When the armistice was signed in July 53, in October of 53, we signed a mutual defense treaty with South Korea. And what's important to understand about that is that mutual defense treaty is not based on a threat from North Korea. In fact, in that mutual defense treaty, the DPRK or North Korea are not used at all. The purpose of the mutual defense treaty is to defend both countries, South Korea and the United States, against threats in the Pacific region. Okay, so those negotiators who developed that treaty were pretty forward-looking, because if you've read the Foreign Affairs article by Moon Chung-in, one of Moon Jae-in's advisors, last spring, and he said when there's a peace agreement, then there's no more justification for U.S. forces on the peninsula. But if you read the Mutual Defense Treaty, the decision on U.S. forces on the peninsula is really only made by two entities: the government of the Republic of Korea and the government of the United States. It has nothing to do with a peace treaty, nothing to do with any international agreements or resolutions, Security Council resolutions. It's a bilateral treaty. And so whether U.S. forces remain or go is a decision for both South Korea and the United States to make, not China, not North Korea. And the Mutual Defense Treaty provides legal standing for U.S. forces to be there. We sure would like to have a declaration of all North Korea's nuclear sites, but of course, Kim Jong-un doesn't want to give those up. In fact, he said to President Moon that if he provides a list of all the facilities, that will become a target list for the United States. I can see his fear on that, but we're really not going to be able to move forward on denuclearization without a complete accounting of all the nuclear materials and everything related to the nuclear program. I've talked about suspension of defensive exercises. The problem with the suspension of exercises is that the readiness of the combined force declines. The military exists to support our civilian leaders, to support the political objective. But military leaders will say, we've got to maintain strength and readiness and capabilities. But in the end, they're going to do what their political masters say. And our political leaders say that we should suspend the exercises in return for a better political outcome. So the military commanders are, of course, creative and inventive, and they are trying to find and are finding ways to maintain readiness in other ways. But if left to their own devices, they want to maintain and train as hard as they can and be as ready as they can. But we have to recognize that in pursuit of the political objective, that we are weakening our combined military capabilities. And that puts South Korea at some risk. As does the comprehensive military agreement that was brokered on September 19th in Pyongyang. That comprehensive military agreement is designed to reduce tensions. And they talk about trust building. And there are a number of measures in that appear to be trust building, confidence building measures. They've established a no-fly zone, eliminated live fire training along the DMZ in this buffer zone. They've reduced the guard posts in the DMZ. The South Koreans have removed some of the south barrier fencing, and not part of the agreement, they've eliminated a number of anti-tank obstacles in the south that are designed to defend against an attack from the north. The problem with the agreement is that everything about it weakens the combined defenses. It weakens the no-fly zone, weakens our ability to conduct what we call ISR, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. Our ability to see into North Korea, to see their preparations for an attack. North Korea doesn't have the same capabilities. So the agreement, by providing that no-fly zone, they don't have the same capabilities that they're losing by establishing that. But the real problem is North Korea's military is postured to attack. It's postured for offensive operations. The South Korean military is arrayed in 5 defensive lines to defend against an attack. And so all of these measures weaken the defenses, but there have been no corresponding measures by North Korea to reduce its ability to attack the South. And so in my assessment, the comprehensive military agreement, while it looks good on paper, it's about trust building, it actually makes South Korea more vulnerable to North Korean attack. Now, I've talked to many South Korean military officers and those who've worked on the agreement, and they say that the comprehensive military agreement is evolving. And so there are continued negotiations. And I met with the Minju Party when they came to Washington, D.C., and they told me that it was too much to ask for the one recommendation that I made. And the one recommendation I make is that North Korea should pull back its artillery 20 to 40 kilometers from the DMZ. That is what would really improve the security of South Korea if it removed its artillery from the DMZ. But they said that was too much to ask. But they've told me that is a topic for subsequent negotiations, and I hope that they make that happen. Of course, they established a ROK liaison office in Kaesong, and they really want to open the Korean industrial complex that was closed. And a lot of South Korean businesses have lost a lot of money. But of course, the Kaesong industrial complex provided a lot of resources to North Korea. It was a conduit for large amounts of cash to help North Korea. As Mount Kumgangsan, the tourist area, that has also been a source of cash as well. And of course, to reopen Kaesong and Kumgangsan really would take waivers of sanctions to be able to do that. We are sustaining maximum pressure. Now, despite President Moon's, some of his recent statements, his trip to Europe, his desire for removing sanctions, we should keep in mind that in September, he stated firmly that there can be no removal of sanctions until there is denuclearization. And he has stated that, and his Deputy National Security Advisor, who was in DC a few weeks ago, we discussed that. Some would say he's just parroting President Trump or Secretary Pompeo's words, but his Deputy National Security Advisor told me that no, that's in fact what he believes, and knows that is, he really has no choice but to follow the sanctions. Now, Steve Biegun who's our special representative, and Minister Lee have established a strategic level working group between North and South Korea. They're going to meet tomorrow. And they've met in person, they meet by video teleconference. This has been, I think, an important way forward for the alliance, and really bears watching because it is what is going to reduce the friction in the alliance. We have a military committee and we have security consultative meetings among the military forces, but we have never had a working group between the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Department of State. And this working group has already borne fruit with the railroad ceremony, the humanitarian medical supplies that are soon to be sent to North Korea, and the United States helping South Korea to get UN waivers to sanctions. So this is really a positive step forward. But we're in a real problem in the military alliance with burden sharing and the special measures agreement. This is the funding by the Republic of Korea government for the stationing costs of U.S. forces in South Korea. President Trump, you've heard his statements about allies not pulling their fair share, not paying for U.S. forces. South Korea pays about $800 million for U.S. forces in South Korea. The cost for U.S. forces is about $1.2 billion. And so they pay $800 million of that. President Trump wants 100% paid. No country anywhere pays 100%. Japan pays 75% of the costs. But he wants 100%. But South Korea is not a freeloader. South Korea spends 2.7% of its GDP on defense, higher than any other NATO country other than the United States. South Korea spent $20 billion on U.S. defense equipment between 2012 and 2016. And the largest U.S. military base outside the United States is in Camp Humphreys, Korea, cost $10.7 billion, 92% of which was paid for by the South Korean government. And then, of course, as we look to who's going to fight the war, if you look at the war plans, currently we have 28,000 troops in South Korea. South Korea has an active duty force of 650,000. And in wartime, South Korean forces the reserve forces will grow to 3.5 million. At the height of the war in Korea, the U.S. will have deployed 700,000 troops. 3.5 million, 700,000. So you look at the difference there. South Korea is more than pulling its weight. But if you listen to the way the president talks, you would think that South Korea is a freeloading ally, and of course they're not. Of course, we are really in Korea for one reason, and that's for U.S. interests. It is not there. We're not there out of the goodness of our heart, benevolent protector of South Korea. We are there for U.S. interests. One, we don't want war on the peninsula, because if there is war on the peninsula, it's going to have global effects. The Korean peninsula, it is, the proverb is, it's a shrimp among whales. It's at the nexus of, really the second and third largest economy, China and Japan, two of the three largest nuclear powers, China and Russia. And so what happens on the Korean peninsula is going to have global effects. And whether U.S. forces are on the peninsula involved in a war or not, the United States is going to suffer if there's a war on the peninsula. And the amount of blood and treasure that will be expended on the Korean peninsula will far exceed what happened in the Korean War from 1950 to 53. And it will be on a scale that the world has not seen. And so our first and foremost priority is on defense and deterrence and deterring war. And when Wang Zhongyap defected in 1997, we asked him, why has North Korea spent all this money on their military and they haven't attacked? And he looked at us like we had a horn grown out of our forehead. And he said, well, the American military. We can't win a war if the U.S. military is on the peninsula. And of course we can't win a war because the United States will use nuclear weapons against the North. And which tells us two things. One, our deterrence and declaratory policy works, but it also explains why North Korea has been pursuing nuclear weapons since the 1950s. And when they sent 250 scientists and technicians to Moscow to get PhDs in technical disciplines. So they've been pursuing nuclear weapons for a long time. North Korea believes that the United States will not attack another country with nuclear weapons. And that may or may not be true, but it's what they seem to believe. Lastly, of course, we've got a summit coming up. Perhaps. So with Kim Yong-chol coming tomorrow, it looks like we're going to see a second summit. Could be Vietnam, Singapore, Bangkok, Mongolia, even Hawaii has been talked about. I don't know where it's going to be. We can take bets and start a pool. From many of the reports, Vietnam seems to be the way to the place for the next one. But we need to be careful when people start touting the Vietnam model for North Korea. I get really sensitive to this. People say, oh, they need to become like Vietnam, or the Chinese economic model. Well, the Vietnamese economic model is one thing, but if you think about the Vietnam model as a whole, it should really scare South Korea, because the United States brokered a peace agreement with North Vietnam, withdrew troops from from South Vietnam, pledged support to South Vietnam. And then when North Vietnam attacked in 1975, the U.S. reneged on its promise. North Vietnam absorbed South Vietnam, and Vietnam became a communist country. From a South Korean perspective, I don't think that Vietnam model looks very good. And so I'm really sensitive when people start touting the Vietnam model, because I think you have to look at the entirety of the history. All right, some of the key questions that I think should be asked. These are the fundamental questions that I am concerned about. Has the regime abandoned its strategy? Its strategy is to unify the peninsula under northern domination. It uses subversion, coercion, extortion, and use of force. And it believes that it must unify to achieve survival, for the regime to survive. Has it abandoned that strategy? Has it abandoned the strategy to split the ROK-US alliance? Of course, the answer to those questions there's only three answers. Yes, they have, no, they haven't, or I don't know. And, the only answer I can give you is I don't know. But as a military planner, planning for the worst case, I would say no, they haven't abandoned that, and we should plan accordingly. But we should hope that they have, but we should plan prudently. Dr. Jung Park from Brookings always asks this question: who does Kim Jong-un fear more, the United States or the North Korean people living, the Korean people living in the North? And I would say it's the Korean people living in the North armed with information. That's who he really fears. But we should really think about that. From a U.S. perspective, the strategic questions are: what do we want to achieve in the region, and what is the acceptable, durable political arrangement on the Korean Peninsula and Northeast Asia that will serve, protect, advance U.S. and alliance interests? I ask that question often of policymakers, and I don't get much of an answer. Mostly everybody focuses on denuclearization. But we really have to think broader than that. Denuclearization, or the nuclear threat, is one problem. So Kim's strategy, vital national interest, survival of the regime. Strategic aim, unification of the peninsula. Key conditions, splitting the ROK-US alliance. And they would like to be recognized as a nuclear power, a Pakistan. They would like to have relations and keep their nuclear weapons. And in fact, they would love to negotiate strategic arms limitation talks, strategic arms reduction talks, just as we did with the Soviets. That would be a good position for them. But of course, we're not going to recognize them as a nuclear state and give them that legitimacy, because I think that all of the counterproliferation people would say that that would undermine the NPT, and we really don't want to go there. But I think we should understand that. Now, I always talk about the big five for the peninsula. War, talked a little bit about that. We want to deter war. Regime collapse, I've worked a lot on this problem, and I could talk about this quite a bit. The problem with regime collapse is that the conditions that lead to collapse will threaten Kim Jong-un. And that could lead him to make a decision to go to war as his only way to survive. Now, we look at that and say that's really kind of far-fetched. He's not going to survive a war. But from his perspective, that may be the only way to survive. So regime collapse is not necessarily something people want to wish for. Human rights are very important. As a military person, you would think that I'm not really concerned with human rights, but I am. And for a number of reasons. One, it's a moral imperative. There are 25 million Korean people living in the north, living in a prison, but it's also a national security issue, because Kim Jong-un denies human rights in order to survive. He has to deny the rights of the Korean people in the north in order to survive. And you look at the Songbun system, the societal classification system, all of that is designed to oppress the Korean people so that he can survive. And I could talk a lot about the prison camps and human subjects for testing, chemical weapons testing, who's mining uranium in North Korea, prisoners. All of that contributes to the security problem. So human rights is a moral imperative and a national security issue. And of course, the asymmetric threats, North Korea has been investing in capabilities, chemical, biological, nuclear, as well as cyber. Today I read how North Korea penetrated Chile's ATM system by using LinkedIn and Skype to do an interview with an employee from a bank in Chile for a job. They had him download an application, an executable file for an application, and that penetrated the bank system and allowed North Korea to penetrate ATMs in Chile. So go figure on that. This is what North Korea is doing around the world. The Lazarus Group, we know about the Sony hack, $81 million from the Bangladesh banks through our Federal Reserve System, by the way, credentials obtained through our Federal Reserve System. So their illicit activities around the world are a threat, and part of their asymmetric capabilities to keep the regime in power, to keep the regime in money. And of course, lastly is, and I don't want to forget, subversion of the Republic of Korea is a key element of their asymmetric threat. They are trying to deliberately weaken South Korea's political system and to curry favor with opposition groups in the South. Unification, this is the biggest challenge, and it is the solution, and I'll talk about that a little bit. I just want to talk about subversion. This is really, really important. And North Korea has invested a lot in these capabilities. But really, it comes down to being an ideological war. And my Korean friends, we talk about shared values. The alliance is about shared values. Individual liberty, freedom, liberal democracy, free market economy, and human rights. Those are the values that we share between South Korea and the United States. But the Kim family regime values, Juche, Kim Il-sungism, the socialist workers' paradise, Songun, which is military first politics, Songbun is the social classification system, Byungjin, the simultaneous attempt to gain nuclear weapons and develop its economy, and of course the denial of human rights to sustain the Kim family regime in power. Which set of values do you want to adhere to? But really, this is the ideological war that is really on the peninsula. But we should not be not neglect the fact that North Korea engages in active subversion of the ROK. And why do they do that? How do they do that? The United Front Department, who, oh, by the way, Kim Yong-chol heads up, they are an overt arm subverting South Korea. And the 225th Bureau trains agents to develop political parties in the South, establish underground political parties, and to sow distrust and unrest in the South. And so we should be very cognizant of these activities. I put this slide up here just to show you. Back in the 1990s, we created this slide as we were looking at the problems of North Korean collapse. After the agreed framework in 1994, there was the arduous march, the Great Famine. Everybody thought North Korea was going to collapse. John Deutsch was the director of Central Intelligence. He told my boss, General Talleli, while you're in command, North Korea is going to collapse. And so you better be prepared for it. In fact, if you study the agreed framework, it was really predicated on the assumption that North Korea would collapse. We wouldn't have to build 2 light water nuclear power plants. We wouldn't have to sustain giving 500,000 tons of heavy fuel oil to the north. We thought they were going to collapse. And so we put this together actually as a way to illustrate how complex and how uncertain things are on the peninsula, and the connection between collapse and war, implosion and explosion, and all the crises that might occur. And so it's deliberately a complex and an overcrowded slide, and to illustrate really at present we're at armistice. We'd like to get to peace, but there's really no clear line from armistice to peace. It's likely going to involve some elements of everything on this quasi-flow chart. All right, so in America, this is what we're concerned about. These are some of the range fans of missiles, and clearly here in San Diego, we are under the rings of their ICBM, as we are in Washington D.C. now. This is an illustration of North Korea's artillery. All those green dots in the north are North Korea's major artillery concentrations. And the light green rings that flow out from those show the range of those artillery and rocket systems. This brown down here is, let's see if this will, I guess that's not really showing up on there. But the brown area down here is Seoul. And so you can see that Seoul is under the range fan of quite a bit of artillery. And this is why we recommend that North Korea should reposition its artillery. We call North Korea an artillery army supported by a scheme of maneuver. For North Korea to attack, they have to attack with their artillery. That is what's going to create penetrations in the South Korean defenses so that their tanks and infantry can flow through. And so if they move them back 20 to 40 kilometers, if they are going to attack the South, we will see them have to reposition their artillery. And so that will strengthen the ability for South Korea and the United States to be ready to defend if they're going to attack. All right, let's see. I think I screwed something up here. All right. All right. I think I pressed the wrong button on this. All right, here we go. I think that'll. Okay. Terrain hasn't changed. In 1950, when North Korea attacked, they used these general invasion routes, the Kaesong-Munsan approach towards Seoul and Uijeonbu, the Chorwan Valley, and of course the East Coast. They're likely going to use the same invasion routes. And of course their campaign plan is predicated on one thing: rapid occupation of South Korea before the United States can reinforce. And that's really their campaign in a nutshell. And most importantly, they've got to get beyond Seoul. They've got to get the crossing sites on the Han River, which is just south of Seoul, and to be able to get across those crossing sites, penetrating the South Korean defenses, and then, of course, marching down to Pusan, which they were unable to do in 1950. But if they attack, we're likely to see a repeat. All right, let me just touch on the Kim family regime and its influence on the people. To me, it's zero-sum between North Korea and South Korea. It is unlikely that either side is going to agree to peaceful unification under the political system of the other. Of course, President Moon is talking about a confederation, one country, two systems, and gradual integration and unification. But to me, that's problematic if you believe and understand that North Korea is trying to subvert the South. that leaves South Korea in a vulnerable position. To me, it's zero-sum, the outcome. And of course, if you look at both constitutions, both countries claim sovereignty over the entire peninsula and the people. So that is really something that's got to change. Now, the North is, the legitimacy of the regime is based on the myth of anti-Japanese partisan warfare. Mentioned the gray zone and irregular warfare. The North Koreans are masters of that. They have the largest special operations force in the world, and they are going to use irregular methods. Of course, their Juche ideology is, self-reliance. I've talked about Songun as the military-first politics, which some people say it's gone away. I don't believe it has. Songbun is how they control the society. Germany is not an exact model for unification. And of course, psychologically, the indoctrination of the people is really something to consider. I met with some escapees from the North before Christmas at an event, and I prefer to call them escapees, not defectors, because they're not defecting from the North, they're escaping from the oppressive society. This young woman who escaped over the Yalu or Amnakgung and into China and then through Thailand and South Korea, she said she believed in North Korea she was free. She followed the teachings of Juche, she worshiped Kim Jong-un, she thought she was free. She said it wasn't until she arrived in Seoul that she felt, she understood what freedom was all about. And so to me that's a very telling description of the psychology of people in the North. A North Korean escapee, Kim Kwang-jin, not the same as the former defense minister, Kim Kwang-jin, but Kim Kwang-jin escaped from Singapore with his family. And actually his son came to the United States when he was 8 years old, couldn't speak English, and graduated valedictorian from Fairfax County High School. He's at Seoul National University now. But I'd ask him about the psychological aspect of this. And he says that North Koreans, or Koreans in the North, suffer from a psychological paralysis. The indoctrination that they have experienced, but the great amounts of information that's now flowing in. And he said, but he really described Koreans in the North as liars. I was shocked when I heard that. He said, but Koreans are liars in the North. And I said, what do you mean by that? And of course, he's not saying it in the pejorative way that we think about it. He said they have to lie to survive. They have to lie to themselves. They have to lie to their families. They have to lie at their workplace, lie to their government. The only way you get ahead in North Korea is demonstrating personal loyalty to the Kim family regime. And so you really have to lie to survive. And that's something that is really, I don't think we as Westerners, or I don't think Koreans in the South can really understand, that kind of oppression. But it's the guerrilla ethos that I'm really concerned about. And everything is built on this ability to fight as guerrillas, to succeed in the revolution. And of course, succeeding in the revolution means one thing: liberating the entire Korean peninsula. And so the revolution has to be completed from North Korea's perspective. Hwang Jong-yap wrote this, and this really, is really telling. For the people in North Korea, where the greatest morality and absolute law is giving one's mind and body to the dear leader and living like a slave, that's the only life permitted in the North. Just think about that. And that's what we're going to have to deal with, ultimately when there is no more Kim family regime. Adrian Buzo from Australia wrote a great book called The Guerrilla Dynasty, and he really describes what happened. Kim Il-sung was the commander of the 1st of the 88th Special Independent Sniper Brigade during the war. He he believed, and he created this myth that he liberated Korea from the Japanese. He conducted one operation, attacked a Japanese police box, killed about 15 Japanese policemen, and that was his entire exploits. But he's built this great myth of how he was the great liberator. And of course, everything depends on that. And the elite of the Kim family regime all descend from those original guerrillas, either married into or are direct descendants of them. All right, I've covered most of these as the threats. There's also drug trafficking, methamphetamines, and of course the slave labor that is taking place around the world. And North Korea is exporting its own people to conduct slave labor. All right, the regime, give me one JDAM missile, I would end it all. But really, let's think about this young child here? What's the future hold for him? Think about all your children, wearing military uniforms and, and wanting to be part of this, this kind of regime. So I think there are only 4 paths to unification. Actually, peaceful unification is the desired. We would like to have that, with reconciliation, respect, and ultimately, and unification is actually our 2 governments' policy. If you go back to June 30th, 2017, President Trump and President Moon signed the joint statement, which said to do 3 things. We want denuclearization of the North. We're going to use maximum pressure to get there. And South Korea is going to create the conditions for peaceful unification, take the lead in creating the conditions for peaceful unification. That's what President Trump and President Moon signed up to do. And so we should focus on peaceful unification. I think it's unlikely to ever happen, but planning for peaceful unification is the hardest thing to do. It is the most complex, and everything that you do in planning for peaceful unification will have application in any other path. So even if it's war, which we want to deter, it's possible, but we want to deter and prevent. Even if it's regime collapse, which is possible, but we want to mitigate that. Or if there is an emergence of an alternative leadership inside North Korea that might seek peaceful unification, everything that South Korea plans for and that we support South Korea planning for will have application. And so planning for peaceful unification is the right thing to do. It's strategically right, it's morally right, and it's practically right. And so that's why I advocate that. Even though in South Korea, there's, many people are opposed to, and you could ask our Korean friends, do you want unification? Most Koreans will say, yes, in my heart I do. But if you ask, do you want to pay for unification? Hell no. That's why surveys in Korea, I think, are sometimes, not an accurate reflection, because Koreans, rightly so, are concerned with the cost of unification. There's probably more PhDs in South Korea who've studied German unification than any other subject. And German unification was expensive, and Korean unification will be as, if not more, expensive. So the bottom line for me is the only way that we're going to see an end to the nuclear program, and I really haven't emphasized this enough, but is really through unification. I don't think Kim Jong-un is going to give up his nuclear weapons. And so I think that we have to play and seek the long-term answer to the Korea question, which is unification, which I would like to see a united Republic of Korea. No more North Korea, no more South Korea, but a united Republic of Korea. And of course, the acronym for United Republic of Korea is UROK, or UROK, which might be a good theme and message with K-pop there. So with that, I will stop there and happy to answer any questions. Grab a sip of water here.
All right, I guess while I'm waiting for you to come up with your own questions, I'll take the privilege of the chair and ask the first question. It's a fascinating talk, and you talked a lot about the threats to the U.S.-ROK alliance. But I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the threats from the U.S.-ROK alliance, kind of one of these classic IR questions about the relationship between security dilemmas. Your own defenses make the other side feel insecure. They then build up, makes you feel less secure. And alliance dilemmas, right? An alliance that's too tight risks entrapment. An alliance that's too loose risks abandonment. And Glenn Snyder pointed out that these are often at odds, right? If you try and solve the alliance dilemma by building a closer, more responsible and mutual alliance, you often exacerbate the security dilemma. So in this region, given that we have at least 2 big security dilemmas, maybe 3, but maybe we'll focus on the one between the Koreas and the U.S. alliance, as well as between the U.S. and China. How do you think about the interaction between these 2 security dilemmas and the alliance?
All right, we got another 45 minutes or an hour, but no, that's a great question. And the analogy that you framed that so eloquently and correctly, I think. First, let me say that I think that really is at the heart of it. North Korea fears the alliance. They fear, survival of the regime is their vital national interest, and the United States is hostile to that in their minds. Even though we have given security guarantees, a number of times, 1994, 2005, 2007, 2012, we've said we have no designs on overthrowing the regime, or attacking the regime. But to the north, words are not enough. Actions are what they need. And of course, they believe that the presence of U.S. forces it demonstrates our hostile policy. So I think that is at the basis of their belief. And they want U.S. forces off the peninsula because that's the only security guarantee that they can trust. And so that's where I think we're at odds. Now, I think you're exactly right in, too tight or too loose. Alliances really have to be managed like a marriage. It is a complex relationship. And so you're right. We want it, especially from a military perspective, we want a tight relationship. We want a strong relationship. And military people will argue that that is what deters North Korea. We don't want to have any gaps in our, demonstrate any weakness because they will take advantage of that. On the other hand, the looseness of the alliance, which kind of might describe where we are right now with President Trump's thinking right now, and abandonment, as you said, I think that's South Korea really fears that they may be abandoned. And I think Japan fears that to a certain extent as well. So I think that this is really the challenge on the Korean Peninsula. The other thing is that for North Korea and South Korea, there's really only one big issue, and that's the Korean Peninsula. Now, of course, South Korea is, the 8th to 11th largest economy in the world. It's a major middle power, so it has global views and responsibilities. Only country in the world to go from a major aid recipient to a major donor nation, by the way, which I think South Korea should be credited for. But I think really for them, it's North and South Korea, it's the Korean Peninsula is the number one threat. For the United States, that's one of many problems that we have. And so managing the alliance is it's kind of asymmetric, for us. Any time that we appear to neglect the alliance, South Korea is worried and upset, and we've got to manage other priorities. And so I think that really makes things complex there. And when we appear to abandon the alliance or neglect it, North Korea tries to exploit that. And I think if you look at North Korea's Kim Jong-un's New Year's speech, you look at what comes out of their propaganda and agitation department, we laugh at their propaganda, calling us names and things like that, but they transmit a lot of messages in their propaganda. And we really need to pay attention to it because they are really often telling us their policies. And so we really have to pay attention to that. But I think you're exactly right. We do pose a threat to the North from their perspective. If we put ourselves in their shoes, we are hostile to them, to their very existence. And so that causes them to think and act in the ways I think that they are thinking and acting. But I don't believe that they are going to trust our words alone. Words have to be backed up by actions. Now, China's an interesting case here. One, there's no love lost between China and North Korea, even though they're the only allies. Their 1963 alliance. They may be closer than lips and teeth. Sometimes I think it's like dentures and rotten gums. But China could solve a lot of North Korea's problems. They could have solved the food problem in the 1990s. They dumped 200,000 tons of rice into the rivers in the Shenyang military district. They could have given all that to the Korean people in the north. The Chinese could really put pressure on the North, but the Chinese, it's the three no's for them. They don't want war in the Korean Peninsula, no war, no instability and collapse, and no nuclear weapons. So they're a pretty good baseball team. They're batting .600, and 2 out of the 3 aren't bad there. Nuclear weapons aren't as big a threat to China as we perceive them to be. They want stability. They want no war and conflict on the Korean Peninsula. The other thing is that while we look at the Korea problem, when China looks at North Korea, they view the United States and how can that impact on their relationship with us. And I think that's it's very interesting given the trade wars, given South China Sea. There is some cooperation between the U.S. and China on North Korea. And so I've heard some people say that that's because China wants one positive thing with the United States. But I also think that China, they proposed the freeze for freeze, which is freezing U.S. and South Korean exercises with freezing nuclear and missile testing, which is actually really where we are right now. They proposed that, they wanted that, and they want the U.S. to stop sanctions, and they ultimately want U.S. forces off the peninsula. And so I think we have to look at their long-term perspective. But mostly they want to maintain the status quo. They don't want anything to go wrong in the region. Remember, there are 2 million ethnic Koreans living on the Chinese side of the North Korean border, so they don't want that economic center to be upset by what happens on the peninsula as well. I could talk a long time about that.
Thanks so much. I'm not even a student of this region, so this was super informative, so thank you. One thing that that sort of kept going through my mind that I'd like to understand better is, you mentioned the primary interest in the Kim regime surviving, but then also in there is a fear of the North Korean people and a goal of unification. And those things seem to be strategically incompatible to me. So I was trying to understand, under what conditions would it actually be strategic? Is it in the strategic interest of the Kim regime to even search for unification under Northern domination, even as a best case scenario? Because if they're worried about a North Korean resistance problem, I would think that the worry about a South Korean resistance problem would make that, out of left field. So I'm trying to understand how those things play out in the strategic environment between the two regimes.
That's a great question, and that's why just as a quick aside, I think regional specialization is really important, and but people who focus on regions, they become blindsided. People who come with a functional perspective or outside looking in, I think that really adds so much to that. So I think there always needs to be a good balance between regional specialization and functional or broader general area, because you get questions like this, which I think are very, very good and important. So I think you make a good case there. So survival is most important. Now, Kim Il-sung designed this system in North Korea to be able to control 25 million people. I think when there is unification, when there's no more regime, the study of what they did scientifically, sociologically, how they have controlled 25 million people is really, I hate to use this word, brilliant. When it's using oppression, and this Songbun Songbun social classification, 51 classes of society, and how that is just. It permeates everything. And so they've built this system to control 25 million people. Some think that they can transfer that system to the South, another 48 million people. Now, I think you're right to be skeptical about that. But I think from their perspective, and I think, again, objectively, speaking, amorally here, what they've done is a pretty brilliant way to control people, and it's something that's going to be studied for a long time. But from the moral aspect, remember in 2014, Justice Kirby from Australia did the Commission of Inquiry in North Korean human rights and said that these are the worst human rights violation and that they're crimes against humanity, and recommended that Kim Jong-un be sent to the International Criminal Court. It will never happen, but so that's it's bad. It's really bad. Take my word for it. Well, don't take my word for it. Take people who've really suffered. But I think that there's that belief that they can do that. Now, so they fear their people. They've developed this system to control that. But to the north, unification is how they've designed their entire ideology. And so when you look at when Kim Jong-un gave his New Year's Day speech, he used revolution 17 times. And if you look in Article 2 and Article 9 of their Constitution, it talks about completing the revolution, which is unification. And whether they believe that or not, we just don't know. I tend to think, they've certainly developed that as part of their identity. And the regime's identity, and I think that they need to do that. Clearly, people would believe, just as President Park Geun-hye said unification will be a bonanza for Korea, for all of Korea, when you combine the resources that are from the north with the industrialization of the south and the expertise of the south, Korea will eventually be a powerhouse. In 1989, the UN Tumen River Area Development Program assessed that there are more untapped natural resources inside North Korea, rare earth metals, minerals, all kinds of things that are untapped because of the political situation. So when there is unification, there's great potential for that. And I think that Kim Jong-un in the north believes that they'll be able to exploit all of that together, unified under their government. But as outsiders looking in, I think it is totally irrational. As you're saying, I think that it is. They're not going to be successful. You're right. The people in South Korea are going to resist. Now there are some. There's a Juche faction. There are some people in the South who've been. Who believe in this Juche ideology. I blame the national security law for that. I blame the lack of education of the South about the true North Korea and the fact that it's illegal to study North Korea, or it has been for many years, that has allowed the romanticization of North Korea. If they had been allowed to study it, they would know the real truth. But they've only heard that North Korea is the enemy up until the recent white paper this week. North Korea is the main enemy. But I think there are some people in the South who do romanticize about Juche ideology and this independence, self-reliant spirit. But I think you're right. The vast majority of the Korean people in the South will resist the North and trying to take over. I'm going to get back row questions now. These are the tough ones.
Okay, I have two questions. One is about how would you advise the South Korean leaders when it comes to balancing the U.S. and China? I was recently in South Korea and talked to some of the mid-level foreign ministry people and think tank people. They, almost to a person, they recognize the importance of the ROK and U.S. security alliance, and they would like to keep that. But they're equally emphatic about South Korea's economic future being increasingly tied to China. Now, they have to do this balance. Now, as the US and China are, ramping up their competition, especially in national security, how would you tell the South Korean leaders to say, how do you balance this relationship? That's number one. Second question is, do you think that, is it possible that there might be some kind of grand bargaining where the US would agree to the Chinese providing, and maybe jointly with Russia, providing some kind of security guarantee to the North Koreans in exchange for the denuclearization of the North? And this is kind of related to that. That is, do you think the US would remove the nuclear weapons from the Korean Peninsula if after open and verifiable evidence that the North has denuclearized?
Your last question, though, we don't have nuclear weapons in South Korea. Are you talking about removing the troops from South Korea? Or?
Right, yeah.
Okay, all right. Just to the last question, again, as I said, the U.S. we can take our troops off anytime we want. South Korea can't keep them there, but we also can't keep our troops there if South Korea doesn't want them there either. So it's a decision by both countries there. So I'll just say that. On the first one, China and the U.S. and balancer. I think this is the Korean dilemma throughout 5,000 years. I said Korea is a shrimp among whales. The corollary is when whales wrestle, shrimp die. And so fighting between China and the U.S. could cause problems for South Korea. So my advice to South Korea, first of all, as you know, China is South Korea's #1 economic partner, not the U.S. So more trade between South Korea and China than between South Korea and the U.S. So that's important to keep in mind. So I think you're exactly right. Korea is concerned with its economic future. And what happened with the decision to deploy THAAD, which is the Terminal High Altitude Area Defense Weapon, the decision to do that to defend Korean and U.S. military forces, that caused a huge response from China, and they used economic warfare to try to influence South Korea. I think we should learn a lesson from that and realize, South Korea ended up, I think, coming through that okay. South Korea suffered economically, but in the end, that is still there, and I think Lotte and others are now back to trading with China. So I think in the end, South Korea stood up to China not to be bullied. But I think that South Korea is in a tough position. It takes really masterful diplomacy to be able to deal with the United States and with China. South Korea, I think, has to help the United States understand their dilemma. And I think the United States needs to be sensitive to that. But we make decisions like on THAAD. Military people here, we make military decisions. Security is first. And we probably could have done some things better, differently on that situation. So I think we can learn a lot about that. And but again, military people, number one, North Korea is a threat to the South. We have to defend against all those threats. THAAD is one of the contributors to that defense. But we have to recognize that that had significant economic impact. So South Korea, I think, has to be really close to the United States and has to make the United States understand South Korea's interests and relationship with China, which I think we know that. But again, as I was answering the other question for Eric here, the United States, we're often distracted with many other priorities. And, South Korea's got, the one main priority. And so there's kind of a mismatch in diplomacy there. But I think that South Korea's got to balance the two. But I don't think they'll ever be as close to China as they are to the United States. And I hope I hope that lasts.
As you mentioned, according to ROK Defense White Paper 2018, there are published a couple of days ago. There are some significant changes. First, South Korea does not call North Korea as enemy anymore. Right. Second thing is that they also changed their terms 3 Ks, kill chain, KAMD, and KMPL into more moderate terms. Yeah. So lots of conservative medias in Korea think that Korea government is on the way to surrender to North Korea. How do you evaluate these changes?
Yeah, that's again, the military. One of the things both our countries believe in is civilian control of the military. We work for our political leaders, and so I think that's the South Korean military and the white paper has to reflect the political guidance of the government. Which many of us, we lament the fact that they don't call it the main enemy. But this isn't the first time. Past white papers have not recognized North Korea as the main enemy either. I compared. I've only seen excerpts of it. I have not read the white paper. I don't think an English version has been published yet. But the excerpts I've read, we should keep in mind that it still describes a very dangerous and threatening North Korea. Its weapons of mass destruction that it may use. And although it's renamed the kill chain and the Korean massive punishment and retaliation plan as to other more moderate terms, it hasn't rejected them. I think the only thing is, now some people argue that this has impact on the soldiers, that they are not as committed to defending against the North if they don't think it's a threat. How many soldiers really read the white paper? But I think that I think this is an attempt by the government to moderate the appearance. But on the other hand, do you really think that message is going to resonate with North Korea and it's going to make them do anything different? So I think in a way it's kind of foolish to try to think that you can tone down those words and North Korea is going to somehow find that acceptable. I think it's a fool's errand. But in what I have read, it still describes the existing threats from the North, which satisfies me. I compared what I read to the Defense Intelligence Agency's report to Congress for 2017. And, we describe the threats in many of the same ways. So our intelligence community and South Korea's, are really kind of in sync there. So I'm not as worried, but I know I've read what the conservatives have said and others in the United States who focus on this. There's going to be some articles coming out in the next few days. Gordon Chang will have something in the Daily Beast that'll really criticize President Moon, as you said, surrendering. There are some that believe that the South Korean government is trying to be too moderate with North Korea, and that does put South Korea at risk. But in terms of the white paper, from what I've read, it sufficiently describes the threat, something I could work with if I was still on active duty.
First, I really want to thank you for the great sharing of your professional opinion over the Korean Peninsula. And then I believe that maybe you could watch the live event of the two leaders of two Koreas meet each other on the border of the Panmunjom and shake hands and walk over the border in the Panmunjom.
It was a brilliant move by Kim Jong-un.
Yeah, so can I ask you about your opinion or thoughts of that event based on your experience and dedication in the DMZ area. Yeah.
I think, I stayed up at night, watched that. 2 all-nighters I pulled in the last year. All you college students, doing all-nighters, but it's been a long time since I've done that. So, of course, the time difference. I was watching that all night in April and then in the Singapore summit in June. So I was very interested in that. I was more worried about Singapore than I was Panmunjom. There are a lot of things I have to reach back and think about. But, of course, Kim Jong-un walking, having President Moon step across the border, brilliant propaganda. I thought that really was well done. But, North Korea made some mistakes, too. I thought it was really interesting that 3 North Korean generals saluted President Moon. But, of course, President Trump also saluted North Korean generals, too. So, I don't know. It was historic. And having spent a lot of time in the Joint Security area and seeing, that delegation come across and go into the Peace House and everything, it was really historic and quite fascinating. I have some optimism that, talking, Churchill said, jaw is better than war, right? So talking is good. And I'm hoping that we can move things forward, and that's a sign of it. But my worry also is that Kim Jong-un is, just like his father and his grandfather, have been masterful at playing all sides off against the other. I mean, we should remember the Korean War. Kim Il-sung manipulated Mao and Stalin brilliantly, and and I think that's been passed down in the generation. So I worry about that. But it was quite historic, and it was fascinating. And then I've seen, a big change in South Korea that was really Kim Jong-un's coming out party. And, he is really exposed to the outside world. And, he's spoken in public more than his father ever has. And, and the people in the South, there's people that say, wow, he's okay, somebody we can deal with, which is good and bad. Like Reagan said, trust but verify. I think we should verify, and then trust. But, then I'm skeptical, but I'm also optimistic. Well, in the Army, I think we've, so what we say, we've reached culmination. We have more offensive capability. We've tired out to. All
right, I have one more question. Okay. I'm struck in this conversation, and also just in kind of casually reading the debate, that there seem to be these 2 themes that come up again and again. One is that unification is probably not going to happen without some scale of conflict, small, big, but it probably has to happen, and that was a big part of your talk here. And the other is that nuclear weapons are perceived as essential for the survival and legitimacy of the North Korean regime. And yet at the same time, there seem to be these 2 fables of reconciliation and unification and denuclearization, which are kind of constantly genuflected towards, right? Now, maybe we can just defer them. They're always in the future. But it seems that they are potentially interactive, right? And so my question is there a set of conditions that you can imagine the United States and the South Koreans actually accepting the de facto situation of mutual deterrence that already exists on the peninsula, and maybe starting to work with that, right? Can we actually recognize that the North Koreans probably aren't going to give up their nuclear weapons, and maybe that could be stabilizing, or at least it would allow us to test whether we're in a security dilemma spiral world, right? Are the North Koreans genuinely interested in their own survival and security, or is this just a tool that they want to use for their ultimately revisionist claims? And perhaps the recognition of this de facto situation, which is never going to change, is a way of getting them to signal what type they actually are.
Yeah, I think that's a great question and a complex one. I think, we talk about unification, regime survival, nuclear weapons. I think that the North believes they're key to their survival. I think that's, they don't trust anybody. And so I think they think that nuclear weapons. I don't think that we're going to, well, the fact is we have de facto recognized them. I think there's no doubt about that. In fact, U.S. Forces Japan just wrote in a briefing slide, if you read the Korean news, they called North Korea a declared nuclear state, along with China and Russia. And that's really spun up. I got more calls from the Korean press on that. As U.S. policy changed, I'm afraid some young briefing officer put that on a PowerPoint slide, and now it's out there, and the change in government policy. So I I think, I told him, I said, really, if they had put self-declared, it might have been all right. But I don't think we can go there to formally recognize them. To me, I think that our focus on nuclear weapons is short-sighted. And I think we do have to, my belief is that we have to cope with this, we have to contain this problem, we have to manage this problem until something new emerges inside North Korea. To me, that's really the only way out. I don't advocate going to war with North Korea. I don't advocate a preventative war. The only preemptive strike I would make is if our intelligence, we have sufficient intelligence to tell us that they're mating a nuclear weapon to an ICBM, and then we might have to strike that. The toughest decision any president would have to make. But I don't believe a preventative war is the way to go, and I don't believe recognizing them is the way to go. I think that we have to work towards solving the Korea question, which is unification, but I don't think that can occur with the current regime in North Korea. And so, there's rising, there are many problems inside North Korea now with corruption. There's almost 500 markets that are growing inside North Korea. Lots of money is flowing in, euros, RMB, dollars. There's changes that could occur inside North Korea. And if a new regime emerges, new leadership, and are we ready to deal with that? I always ask this question of policymakers, just think about this. What if you learned today that Kim Jong-un was dead? What actions would you take? And that gets to your question, are we ready to deal with that? I know what our answer would be, we'll wait and see what happens, but maybe we should be ready, and South Korea should be ready to reach out to a new leadership that emerges and be ready to deal with that. Sang-Min Cho, who was a PhD student at Georgetown, did a great paper on assassination and analyzed, could there be an assassination in North Korea? And he came to the conclusion, a very controversial conclusion, that the only way there could be an assassination of North Korea, of Kim Jong-un, it would have to happen the same way that Park Chung-hee was assassinated. Somebody close with access and placement who, acting on his own, would kill him. And we would never see that coming. We would not be ready for that. And of course, when he compared that to Park Chung-hee, and he based that on his analysis on assassinations throughout history, and he said that was the only one that is a likely parallel. Of course, many people in South Korea were very upset with that, but he's now a professor at the Asia Pacific Center in Hawaii, so he's doing pretty well. But I think there's got to be change within North Korea. That's really the way out of this. And until then, we got to cope, contain, and manage.
All right, well, if there are no further questions, please join me in thanking Colonel Maxwell for a really fascinating talk.
Thank you.